from some of the work that Jenny has done. So Jenny is an associate professor of molecular, cellular, and developmental biology at the University of Colorado Boulder. And her story is that she got her PhD in neuroscience at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and went on to do her postdoctoral work at UC Boulder with Bill Wood. She wanted to get into developmental biology and genetics. It is during that time that she started teaching, and then she worked with Bill on the Science Education Initiative at UC Boulder and joined their faculty there. Jenny has worked a lot on developing and using active learning materials and concept assessments. She also shares them very openly with us, and we're going to gain a lot of information from that. Currently, she is working on studying in-class peer discussion, how that happens, as well as how do students engage in problem solving, especially in the context of a genetics classroom. I think that is something that she's going to share with us today. So I'll give the stage to her. Oh.
Thank you so much. So I'm actually not mic'd. This is just for the video. Can you guys hear me okay? Is that all right? Great. Hi, Renee. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. It turns out that people from University of Colorado come to University of Utah. So I ended up seeing 3 previous students today. So that's wonderful. So I'm thrilled to be here. It's wonderful to get a chance to talk to you guys about my work. And please feel free to interrupt at any time, ask questions. And probably I'll run out of time, because I always seem to run out of time. So we'll just stop when it's time to stop. And hopefully you guys will get all your questions answered. So, as Dana said, I'm going to talk a little bit about exploring what students do in the classroom. And first, before I start, I want to thank the people who have been helping me. This is my team, graduate student Alex, undergraduate Oscar, Scott, my research assistant, and postdoc Jennifer Avina. And they're all helping to work on problem-solving studies that we're currently engaged in that I might not get to today. So I also have to thank people not pictured here, Jeremy, Katie, and Sarah, who helped me with the things I am going to talk about for most of my talk today. So I want to start off by saying that active learning is a very broad idea that encompasses many, many different kinds of possible ways of interacting with students in the classroom. And there's no one way to improve your teaching, and there's no one way to ensure that students are learning. There are a billion different possibilities. And so when I talk to people who are thinking about changing the way their department approaches teaching, or they're interested in studying student learning, I always want people to know that there's really a lot of different ways to be successful. Here, I listed up here just some of the things that are active that students can do in the classroom. Even something like writing or drawing is active. What I'm particularly interested in is interactive types of behaviors. So interactive is when students are talking to each other, not just thinking actively or doing something actively for themselves. And so that's a little bit different. Some people suggest that it's maybe better than just plain active, because there's an opportunity for communication. So there's benefits to students having to talk to each other and explain their ideas to other people. As you all probably know, when you have to teach something, you actually learn it better, or maybe you don't learn it for the first time when you have to teach it. So interacting with peers stimulates what we call cognitive processing, as well as just knowledge construction, so having to explain your ideas. The other benefit of talking with people in the classroom, talking with each other, is that it creates a community which sometimes it's difficult to create in a large classroom. I teach primarily large lecture classes, and we have, in our introductory series, 400 to 500 students at a time. So I know that you guys have even more, probably. So we're talking about scenarios where the students may feel isolated, they may not really know what's expected of them, and giving them a chance to connect with each other in the classroom not only benefits their learning, but helps them feel like they're part of the community. So these are why I think interactive techniques are worthwhile. I feel like I can't see. I'm going to come over here. So I want to tell you a little bit about the work that I've done using clicker, the clicker technology. You guys use clickers here. I hear that you have turning technology. We use iClicker, and the whole campus uses the same system, which makes it really nice. And so I've been interested for years in how students interact with each other during clicker discussions, and I finally decided to codify it, and that's what I'll tell you about today. So this is just one form of active learning, obviously. As I said, many other ways that you can do it. But it can provide an opportunity for students to learn from each other. It can also provide an opportunity for them to think about what they know for themselves. We follow sort of a standard cycle of clicker question use, which is that we ask a question, we let the students think about it individually. This may be actually that they have a minute of quiet time where they then vote on their own, or it may be just a short pause while they think about it. Then we let them discuss and vote, and then after we see what they are thinking, then we follow up with them to make sure that we hear their ideas. If there's dissension, make sure that everybody understands what's going on. So there's a couple points here that are interesting for the instructor. One is during the peer discussion, you can listen to what the students are saying to each other. And then when they vote, you can see what they are actually voting. My technique is to not show the students the distribution of the votes until after I let them talk about why they think something is true, because I don't want to bias them. So if they see that 75% answered a particular way, they might be biased in terms of what they're willing to talk with each other about or to share with the rest of the group. So just to give you an example, so I teach genetics, so my examples are all genetics, sorry, for those of you who don't like genetics. So this is a question that I might ask students on the first day of class. I don't expect them to know anything necessarily about genetics, but it's a fun way to get them talking. So everybody knows that your earlobes are either attached or unattached, and it's actually a trait controlled by more than one gene. But for simplicity, if you imagine that one phenotype is dominant, controlled by the dominant allele, and that you have to have 2 recessive copies to have this attached phenotype, then we ask them this question: if the unattached earlobes are due to a dominant allele versus a recessive allele, what can you conclude? So do you guys want to take a second and just read the answers, and you can talk to your neighbor and see if you agree with your neighbor about the correct answer. I'll give you like a minute. So pretend you're students. You need a partner. I know, I was going to have people raise their hand, but then they have to admit. All right, so pretend you're students, pretend that your fingers are a clicker, so you can hold up a 1 if you think it's, this way nobody else can see what you're voting. Hold up a 1 for A, 2 for B, 3 for C, and then I can see what you guys think. It's much harder than a clicker, or you can hold it up in the air if you don't care. Yeah. All right, so I see some 3s, I see some 1s. What do you think students would have picked as the answer to this question? 1, attached earlobes are seen less frequently than unattached earlobes in the population. Why do you think they would choose that? Right, so they see the word recessive and they think that means frequency. Exactly. And so in a group of students surveyed one year, we had a lot of people voting for A and some people voting for B and fewer voting for C. And then we gave them a chance to talk to each other and said, okay, vote again. And they switched a little bit. You can see that they didn't all go to the correct answer, but there was a movement towards understanding maybe the principle that recessive didn't equate to frequency. And depending on the scenario, we would then talk about it some more, hear some ideas about why people might think that recessive equated to frequency, et cetera. The idea being here that what's interesting is what happens in the student discussion. Are they able to convince each other of why one answer might be more logical or reasonable than another? Yeah. Well, I've used it in lots of different scenarios. I've used it as just a way for people to get to know each other. Like on the first day of class, like nobody really knows the answer, but it's a good way to break the ice and talk about what does dominant mean, what does recessive mean. So I've used it that way, and I've also used it when they're supposed to know the meaning of the word. Interestingly, you get a similar distribution in both cases. So previous work, including some work that I did with a former postdoc of mine, has shown that in a scenario like this, if you let students talk about their ideas, they do better after their discussion. In other words, they're more likely to select the correct answer. But they're also more likely to select the correct answer on another question that's related to this question. So they actually seem to be learning from their discussion with each other. So not only is it an opportunity for them to share ideas, hopefully it's also an opportunity for them to learn from each other and be able to apply that to another similar question. So in my opinion, several things go into deep conceptual learning, which is what I really hope my students are going to get when they are finished with my class. They're probably not going to get to deep, but maybe they'll get below superficial. I want them to be able to think critically, and I think that part of that is that they have to understand how to reason through something that maybe they're not familiar with, to be able to explain their reasoning. And I ultimately want them to be able to solve novel problems, or at least problems that aren't exactly like things they've already solved before. So I wanted to ask, do students engage in these components of thinking and learning at all during clicker discussions? And even though I like to walk around the classroom and listen to what students are saying, it's totally impossible to teach and listen at the same time and actually remember what you heard past about 5 minutes in the classroom. Maybe that's just age, but it's not easy to remember what you hear in the student discussions. So the studies I'm going to tell you about, we actually recorded student discussions so that we could go back and listen to them later and figure out what students were saying. So to do this, we had two different ways of doing it. In an upper division course, the students sat around tables like this, and they had a microphone in the middle of the table, and they could just talk about their ideas, and the microphone would pick it up. That was a great way to start the project, but it didn't really get at my question, which was, what do introductory students doing? What are students doing, freshmen, sophomores taking intro bio? Are they actually doing something useful during clicker discussions? So for that, students were actually wearing little microphones, and they had to, of course, consent to be recorded. They picked up a microphone when they walked in the classroom. They always worked with the same group, and then we just recorded their discussions over time. Unfortunately, there's no way to capture student discussions without them knowing that you're capturing their discussions, because it's against the law to do that. And so you have to get their consent so they know they're being recorded. There's always that component. People always ask me about that, and there's no way for us to know whether other students would have had totally different discussions, but this is the representation that we have. So I want to tell you a bit about what we did with the data. So we record these discussions, and then we transcribe them. And we know what group the recording comes from. We know who they are, but we didn't record their names as we recorded what they said to each other. We just used student 1, student 2, et cetera. And so this is actually a discussion from the developmental biology course that I used to teach, which is an upper level course where I did the first body of work on clicker discussions. And they're talking about homologous recombination and generating a transgenic animal. And so it doesn't really matter what the text is, honestly. But what we were looking for was, do they explain their ideas to each other? Do they have a reason for picking their answer? Because this is a multiple choice question that they're going to answer with clickers. And so what we do is we take this whole conversation, we look at what the students do, and then we give it a code, a number, essentially. And it's not meant to suggest necessarily that 3 is 1 step better than 2. It's simply a scale. So if no reasoning is used at all, it's a 0. If one person provides reasoning, even if it's really awesome reasoning, but only one person does it, then it's a 1. And then we're sort of privileging when they actually talk to each other and exchange ideas. We say that's a 2, and if they do it really well, it's a 3. So again, it's not it's not really a linear scale, but it's just a way of categorizing what's happening in the discussion. So in this discussion, we only have one student who's really using reasoning. So student 4 here has an idea about how something is working in this homologous recombination event. People are sort of supporting that idea, and the same person, again, has more ideas about why a particular answer might be correct. So in this particular little blip of the transcript, we would call this a 1 because only one student is actually using reasoning in their discussion. So what we wanted to do now was test 3 different kinds of scenarios. In the first scenario, we were interested in seeing whether students responded to a cue from the instructor. So I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I feel like they're not listening to me. So I've always wondered, do they respond to what I'm saying? Or maybe it's different here than it is in Colorado. You know, will the students do what you ask them to do? Are they listening to what you're suggesting is good for their learning? And I was skeptical that they listened to the cues. So I wanted to test whether, if they were cued differently before they began their peer discussion, would they have a different kind of discussion? So the way this worked was there were either answer-centered cues given to the students or reasoning-centered cues. And they always had a clicker question discussion. The format was very much the same. It was, the only thing that differed was how the instructor gave the cue at the beginning. So either it was figure out the right answer, and we'll discuss that answer afterwards, or it was discuss your reasons and be prepared to explain your ideas. So subtly different, but definitely different, right? In one case, you're focused on the answer. In another case, you're focused on the reasoning. And again, like I said, I was very skeptical that this would be impactful, that this small cue would make a difference. But what we found was that it did make a difference. So what you see here are, we recorded 4 groups of students, 3 to 5 students in each group. So again, we're only recording, you know, about 20 out of 80 students, so it's a subset of the students. But when they were given a reasoning-centered cue, they were much more likely to get to this higher level of exchange of quality reasoning. So they were more likely to exchange fully fledged reasons for their answers when they were given that cue. These are the same students, either given the cue or not given the cue. So there actually is an impact of what the instructor is saying. The other thing you might notice is that the students are actually using reasoning quite frequently. This is an upper division course. So in this particular example, a large fraction of the discussions used reasoning, which was wonderful to see. We've been hoping that they will use reasoning for the last 3 years. So when they get to this class, it's good that they are actually using reasoning. When we repeated this with introductory students, we do not see nearly as high of a use of reasoning, but we still see that shift towards more reasoning when the instructor prompted to use reasoning. So even though it seems like a very small cue, you can have an effect on the students if you tell them what you expect of them. So usually we're used to telling them what we expect of them content-wise, but this was just a cue for how they should talk to each other, and it made a difference. So we also were curious about whether students would be influenced by the presence of a peer facilitator. So I don't think you guys have a learning assistant program here yet, but you probably have undergraduates that you've worked with before that maybe interact with other undergraduates, or you've worked with TAs, whatever the level of student you've worked with. We're calling a peer facilitator, in our case, another undergraduate who's taken the course, performed well in the course, and now has come back to help the students learn the material in the course. So we had, here you can see an LA here in the middle talking to 2 fellow students, helping to explain, I think, physics in this case. We have learning assistants in all of our science departments helping instructors with their large enrollment classes. So here I thought, this is conducted in an intro bio classroom. Here I thought there could be an effect of somebody nearby facilitating the discussion, hanging out near the students and saying, hey, you guys, you know, what do you think? What are you concerned about with this question? What do you think the answer is? Why do you think the answer is that? So we thought that that kind of behavior, that kind of one-on-one help with a group might increase their use of, again, reasoning, their chance of explaining their ideas to each other. So we set it up in a similar way to the first experiment that I just talked about. We had groups of students who interacted with an LA some lecture periods and not other lecture periods. And that was because it was really easy because there were a lot more students than there were LAs. And so LAs were rotating around the room, sitting sometimes with recorded student groups and sometimes with unrecorded groups. So we had, again, a comparison between the same groups of students with and without a learning assistant. Obviously, the content is different from lecture to lecture, but we looked at the levels of the questions that were being asked, and We can't totally normalize it because it's just a normal classroom environment that we're trying to collect data from. But we think it was a relatively good sample of different kinds of clicker questions that were asked and different kinds of content that were all approximately similar to each other. All right, so what we saw after collecting this data, transcribing the discussions, and then looking at the frequency of the reasoning, and also looking at the way students exchange questions, because that's another interesting thing. If a student's engaged in thinking about something, they're likely to ask each other, well, why do you think that? Or, I don't really understand the question, can you explain this to me? So requesting information from fellow students or asking for an explanation, those kinds of behaviors are very common in these student transcripts. What we found with LAs was that they were much less likely to request information directly from each other, like what did you vote, which is a very common behavior normally. Instead, they were asking other questions like why did you vote that? And we think that's because they were often asking the learning assistant, why is this true? Or I need help with this question. So their behavior was being influenced by the presence of this other student. They were much more likely to request feedback. And again, we think this was primarily feedback from the LA. The LAs weren't mic'd, and so it was a little bit hard for us to hear exactly what the LA was saying. But just from the nature of the discussions, it seemed like a lot of those feedback questions were to the LA. This is what I think. Am I right? And they had longer discussions. So you can see that there is some influence on their behavior. But what we didn't see was an increase in the use of reasoning between the students. And at first, I was like, dope. I was really sad because I was really sure that this was an awesome thing for these peer tutors to be in the classroom with these other students. And so my hypothesis was not supported that they were going to have an impact on reasoning. And then I thought, wait a second. LAs are students, just like the students they're helping. How do I know what they're doing? Maybe they're not doing the things I would expect them to do to support use of reasoning in the student discussions. So we went back and we looked for all the instances where we could hear what the LA was saying to the students. And it wasn't all the time that we could hear the LA, but most of the time we could hear something about what they were saying. So we could characterize the way they were interacting with the students. And what we found was that they used a variety of different ways of interacting, not surprisingly, right? So they asked prompting questions like things like, well, why do you think it might be that way? Or have you ever thought about it this way? They used direct requests for reasoning, like why did you answer C? Explain your reasoning to me. They did things like just providing statements of information to the students, or they acknowledged that the student had said something like, yeah, sure, that's right, or yeah, that's a good idea. Or they did this thing in the middle, which was that they answered the question for the student using the reasoning that we were hoping the students would use. So, spoiler alert is that the providing reasoning part is not useful to the students, right? Because then the LA is doing the thinking and reasoning and the students are not doing it themselves. So we found actually then when we characterized the student responses to the LA behaviors, we found that in fact when LAs provided reasoning, the students just stopped thinking because they were getting the answer from their more knowledgeable peer. So it's kind of cool because, let's go over that for now, and maybe go back to it. It's kind of cool because now we use this in our learning assistant training. So we tell them, by the way, you're going to be tempted to explain everything that you know to the students that you're working with because it feels really good when you know something, but it doesn't help them because they have to construct it for themselves. So what this graph shows you is that the student responses depended very much on what kind of a prompt they got from the learning assistant. So the graph looks complicated, but it's really not that bad. Down here are what the LAs are saying to the students, what kind of behavior they're using. And then the little bars just show you the kind of responses the students have. And in light green is asking a question. So students often ask questions back and forth of each other or of the LA. The next bar is using reasoning. Then we have background statement. And then this category is ending the discussion, just stopping. And there's no more things happening except for maybe it's talking about the football game or something like that. So prompting questions were really good for actually them asking more questions of each other because they were trying to figure out what they knew and what they needed to know. Requesting reasoning was awesome at getting students to actually use reasoning because in response to a direct question about whether or not they understood the reason for their answer, they felt compelled to actually use reasoning and talk about their reasoning ideas with each other. So there's a big increase in that particular behavior. if the LA provided basically an explanation for the students, told them how to think about it, then it wasn't all bad. The students asked questions frequently in that condition, but very infrequently did they actually use their own reasoning or provide any other kind of information to each other. The most common thing that they did, and more common in this condition than in any other condition, was they just stopped talking. So it ended the discussion. So if you tell one thing to your undergraduate or graduate assistants, tell them not to give the answer to the students, because if you care about them constructing ideas for themselves, giving the answer just shuts them down. They walk away thinking, yeah, I know the answer now, but they really haven't created that knowledge for themselves. And the background statements provide questions primarily. So again, we thought this was pretty interesting because although it didn't come out in the balance that the presence of the LAs increased the frequency of reasoning, what it did show us was that the students were listening to what the LAs were saying, just like they were listening to the instructor. So they are listening to what's going on in the classroom. They are picking up cues from peers or from the instructor, and they respond accordingly. To me, this just meant it should be easy to change their behavior. Because if we give them the right cues, there's at least a higher chance that they'll follow our instructions. So to me, it made me feel really happy, because I thought, it's probably not that hard for me to just give better cues in the classroom. I don't have to change my material. I can just think about what I want the students to do and then cue them, and hopefully they'll actually do that behavior if this data can be applied to all of those students. Okay, so I already told you this. They respond to the types of prompts provided, and they're more likely to use reasoning if they're given the appropriate prompt. So the last study I'll tell you about the clicker discussions is about how much do you have to scare the students in order to get them to be productive in the classroom. So this is a study about accountability. Let me just tell you a little bit about the way we do our clicker questions. They're all just for participation credit. So I don't teach these intro bio classes, but I teach genetics, and I do it the same for my students. It's just to get them there and engaged in the process. They don't get credit for being right. They just get credit for participating. So the concern is, if they don't really care about the answer being correct or incorrect, are they actually even really participating fully in the process of thinking about the answers and talking with their peers? Or is it just sort of a, I can press any button here? So in order to study whether some accountability might make a difference, we designed an experiment where we had a set of students who were requested to share ideas after the clicker discussion. So everyone's talking, and then after everyone stops, the instructor would say, okay, well, who wants to tell me what their group was talking about? And they just ask for a group to volunteer their answer. Very friendly, same group always volunteers primarily, but it was just a way of getting people to talk from the audience. Versus a random calling method where the groups are determined, they determine their own groups. And I like this easy technology, so I'll tell you how we did it. We pass out index cards. This is like 400 people in a lecture class, remember? So we pass out index cards, pre-numbered, 1, 2, 3, et cetera. And we ask people to get into groups with the people around them. And when they get an index card, they just write their names on the back. So if the two of you are a group, then you write your 2 names on the back of the index card. Or maybe you pick up Nana as your 3rd member, and the 3 of you are now a group. And we say, hey, you guys should work together for the rest of the semester. You guys be a group and help each other in class. And then we collect all the index cards. And now we have everybody's name. And we just shuffle the index cards, and we just start picking the top index card off. Or you can put it in a box and randomly select. But whatever you do, they don't know who you're going to call on. So we call this a pretty soft accountability because, again, there's no credit for answering the question. You could be like, I don't care, I'm not going to answer, but nobody ever does that. But there's maybe like an embarrassment factor, like if you didn't talk to your group and you have nothing at all to say, maybe that doesn't feel so good to you if you get called out like that as a student. So our theory, or our hypothesis, I guess, more accurately, was that this relatively soft accountability, this sort of fear of embarrassment kind of issue, might prompt people to have more meaningful discussions with each other. Because I didn't want to get called on and say, I didn't talk to my group mate, I have no idea. So we had 2 consecutive, oops. We had data from 2 consecutive years, so these are not the same students. They're in the same exact class, taught by the same instructors, same clicker questions matched, but not the same students. So in the volunteer call section, those students only ever were volunteering, and in the next section, they were only ever being called on in this group random calling way. We analyzed 100 discussions, and here's what we found. So if you look just at the reasoning scale, remember 0, no reasoning, up to 3, the better form of exchanging ideas with each other, you can see that these introductory students do not use this higher level of exchange of reasoning very frequently, 9% of discussions compared to 11%. But what changes is that here in the middle, a lot higher frequency of actually exchanging reasons with 2 or more people. So this is a significantly different distribution. They're basically 2.7 times more likely to use the higher level of reasoning using logistic regression analysis. So we think this is a really interesting finding that, again, just the sort of peer pressure of being in a large classroom and maybe getting called on seemed to stimulate people to take it a little bit more seriously. This doesn't mean they learned more. We didn't actually measure performance. We just were looking at their interactions and how they talked to each other. And we saw more productive discussions under conditions of soft accountability. There was a couple other things that were interesting. It increased the frequency of them asking for feedback from each other. So there were no LAs in these sections. We purposely excluded any conversations that included LAs because we just wanted to look at the student behavior. So they're asking each other for more feedback. And so we think that basically there's more collaboration happening in a condition where the students think they might need to explain their thoughts to the whole group. This is super easy to implement. I do it with my genetics class. It literally takes 5 minutes for the students to write their names on the index cards and for you to collect them. And what the students, I think, don't really appreciate is that their name's probably not going to come up that frequently when you have a classroom that large. I mean, I try to call them like 3 groups a day, 3 to 4 groups a day. But I've got like 50 groups, maybe 60 groups, so they might get called on once or twice in the semester. But they still seem to get the idea that they could get called on at any second. And so they're not bothered by it, they're not upset by it. So we also told them about their feelings about this sort of procedure. And they said they rated it equal to the way they'd rated previous classrooms with no group accountability. So they didn't seem to think it was threatening or anything like that. And they also reflected that they were more likely to understand something if they'd engaged in a discussion with their neighbor. So it seemed like they were buying into this easy technology. Yeah.
Sorry, were you asked? It wasn't clear. Were you asking individuals within the group to provide it?
No. So great question, because well, what we decided to do was group. So call on the group, and then let them decide who their spokesperson was. So the problem with that is that within a group of 3 or 4 people, there probably still is the dominant person who's more likely to volunteer the answer. And it could be that that means that in that group, that one person's getting more out of the discussion than other people are. Or it could just mean that that person is more vocal and is willing to speak in front of the entire class. It doesn't necessarily mean that the quieter people aren't learning from the discussion. So we went with the group because it is kind of scary. Like, we have to hand them a microphone to talk about their reason because otherwise nobody can hear what they're saying. So we didn't want to freak people out, basically. Other people have done the direct individual accountability, call on a student by name, they have to answer the question. So this was especially softer in that way, that it was up to the group to answer.
And was there any way for members of the group to kind of dissent? Is there a mechanism for them to express dissent with whatever the spokesperson was sort of?
I think certainly. I don't see that happen very often. When I'm doing this in my own classroom, I will often say something like, did your whole group agree on that answer? So to see if there was dissent. And sometimes people will offer, well, we weren't really sure. 2 of us thought this and 2 of us thought that, and this was why. So we do hear that there is dissent, and there's no reason for them not to explain that dissent because there's no penalty for being wrong. And that's part of the other reason why I don't give credit for these questions, is because I want them to have dissent. I want them to be arguing about what they think the correct answer is. So I think there's room for that, but it's all about how you execute it, right? It's really about you as the instructor deciding how to interact with that group you've called on and how to kind of make it be meaningful to them.
Did you look at, for
Great question.
I've seen other statistics that say if you just ask for volunteers, you're very unlikely to get females to
Right.
express their ideas. The same with minorities.
Right.
In this soft accountability, is it more likely that you have vocal females, vocal minorities?
We did not measure that, so I'll just tell you my personal experience is that when I use this methodology, first of all, there's a lot of groups that are all women, so that means a woman has to speak. And there could be a group that's all minority as well, because again, we're not regulating their groups, they're self-chosen. So someone has to speak in the group, and sometimes if it's a mixed group of men and women, we will have a woman who speaks up and is the spokesperson. So I wouldn't say that I hear more male voices in the classroom when I use this technique. I do think that men tend to volunteer their answers more frequently and ask questions more frequently, but with this type of methodology with randomness, I think you make that go away sort of just by virtue of the groups being frequently all one gender. Great question. I mean, these are things that we didn't measure but could measure in the future if we were interested in measuring that. We don't have, we don't take data from the entire class on ethnicity or preparation for college or first generation status and then take that data and compare it to the status of who actually speaks. That would be a whole additional study which would be really interesting, but I didn't measure those things in this study. Other questions? All right, so I'll just conclude, and I have a few minutes. I'll talk a little bit about problem solving. One of the things that was interesting in our studies is that we have some clicker questions that are, we think, more challenging, that they basically are requiring students to engage in higher order thinking like analysis or synthesis, things like that. But we found that that kind of a question, although we think they're more interesting and more challenging, did not necessarily provoke more discussion amongst our introductory students. That may be because it was lost on them, like it was too sophisticated for them, or it might just be that they actually are more likely to talk about the details of some mechanism that's more like of a memorization question because they know it already, or they don't know it, so it's easier for them to exchange reasons. But we thought this was interesting because ultimately we want students to be able to answer these more higher cognitive level questions. Maybe we're not preparing them as well as we should be if we're asking a lot of clicker questions that are just memorization based. And we also think that these clicker discussions are pretty short. Like on average, they're like about 1.5 to 2 minutes long. So not very much time. Like for me, that's barely enough time to think about what my answer might be, let alone talk about it with my neighbor. Students are much faster than we are. But it's just, I wondered whether this was really enough time to capture the complexity of what is happening in a student's mind or the complexity of the discussion that might be occurring between students. And so that has prompted me to think more, about problem solving, which I'm going to tell you about next. Yeah. Great question. How do we decide how long to let the discussion go? People differ in their technique for deciding how long to go. Some people are like, 1.5 minutes, that's all I've got time for, right? So they just look and they tell the students if their votes aren't all in, because you can see the number of people who have voted, they say, come on guys, time to get your votes in, and they just cut it off at 1.5 minutes. Other people will wait and listen in the classroom. Are people still discussing productively? How much time should I give them? I know what happens to me a lot is someone will put their hand up and I'll go over and talk to them, and then 2 minutes or 2.5 minutes will have gone by and I was talking to somebody, so I wasn't watching the clock. So it varies. In the particular studies that we did with our introductory biology instructors, they tended to pretty much keep it at 1.5 minutes. Sometimes let it go longer than that, but they seem to be of the mentality of that's all the time we have to discuss the questions. So what's the ideal time of discussion? Probably at least 2 minutes, but it also depends on how hard the question is, right? If it's just a quick check-in, you're really just wanting to see if the students understand some basic concept. Maybe you don't even want them to discuss it. Maybe it's just a vote and move on. But if it's complex and you want them to really think about something, 2 minutes might be your minimum. Renee?
Do you look at the beginning and the end of the semester? Do you think they get better at this?
I wish I'd had you working with me when I was conducting these studies. So we wanted to look at that, but we ran out of resources before we could really do it. We did collect data at the beginning and the end of one semester, but we didn't collect enough data to really be able to use it as a comparison, because we had the same hypothesis that you just proposed, that students should get better at talking to each other over the course of the semester. We should see some kind of improvement at the end compared to the beginning. I don't know the answer. Yeah. All right, shall I tell you a little bit about problem solving? Okay. So what we're looking at in this study is how students normally solve more complex problems, what they struggle with, how we can kind of capture what they're doing, and how we can help them learn this skill. I don't know why my words are being cut off on the side there. So let me tell you a little bit about what I think problem solving is. So in this case, I'm talking about constrained problems that have a single correct answer, which are not as interesting as open, unconstrained problems for which there could be many possible solutions. But those are way harder to analyze on a large scale. So I decided I would start with constrained problems that have an answer and have sort of a way of solving them. And then later, I could go and do the more complicated ones. So I want to give you an example of what I think is a cool problem, and it's got nothing to do with biology, but I want to share it with you anyway. So this was a problem that my son brought home from school. This is my youngest son, Sammy. He's 10, and he brought home this really kind of super challenging math problem. I don't actually want you guys to solve it because it takes a while, but it's it's basically about figuring out the factors of a number. And so there's this scenario where students are opening and closing locker doors, and if you know the questions about factors, you can sort of figure out that there's a pattern. And this door, these locker doors are open or closed based on how many people have come before you to open and close the locker. Well, this was super challenging for these 10-year-olds, but the teacher had said, go home and think about it, talk about it with your parents if you want to, see if you can solve it. My son was super motivated to solve this problem. I'm not sure why. I think it was because the teacher had presented it as a challenge, like you probably won't be able to solve this. So I'm going to solve this. So he presented me with a problem, and I was like, what? I'm like, how are we going to solve this? I have no idea. It seemed really challenging to me. So I wanted to share with you the process we went through because I thought it was so much like the process that anybody might go through in solving a problem. And it's been informing kind of my research. So the first thing that I said to him was, what are you guys studying in math? Because I have no idea what this problem is about. And luckily, he could tell me we're studying factors. And I was like, okay, I get it, okay. Now I have like a frame of reference. So I had to identify the type of problem. He already knew that it was about factors, but I didn't. So I had to first figure that out. And then we made some hypotheses. So we were like, well, what if an odd number and an even number are different? So we tested that hypothesis. Wrong, it didn't work. And then the two of us both were like, well, we keep getting this closed locker door. It's usually closed when we try a number, open, closed, open, closed, open, closed. It's usually closed. So when we realized that, we're like, we're looking for some small subset of numbers that fit into this category. So we had like an inspiration, basically. And we looked for a pattern. We found a pattern. We realized that there was only one kind of number that could fit into this category. I probably didn't give you guys enough time to think about the problem to really know. But the key was there were sort of two moments of inspiration in this problem-solving step. And we had to have some hypotheses that we tested and either proved or disproved relatively early on. So there are some things about this question that are much more maybe math-based for problem solving than most biology problems might be. But I thought the process might inform us about what students would do in the classroom as well if they didn't know what the problem was about. So I'm giving them genetics problems, not math problems. But genetics problems sometimes involve math, like calculating probability. And they often also involve looking at like a pedigree and trying to discern like what the genotype of individuals is within the pedigree. So I thought there was a lot of overlap with just a regular math problem, and I wondered what students would actually do with these problems. So we developed, after interviewing some students on a set of genetics problems, we developed a series of codes for kind of characterizing what was going on in the students' minds as they were solving the problem. And I should say that in the interview, they were telling us what they were doing. So they were explaining their method for trying to solve a problem. And we were recording the interviews. So we then, after some time working together with these, with the transcripts from the students, we developed this set of codes that you see here. And this is not a full coding code book, but it includes sort of the things we see most commonly. So I'll just show you the definitions here. It's a lot of words, sorry. But they do all of these things generally in every problem-solving event when they are actually really considering solving the problem. So some students don't work very hard at solving the problem, and they don't do all of these steps. But even when they get the question wrong, it turns out that students do a lot of these things. So they often clarify, like reread the question, or identify critical features. And these kind of fall under the category of what I did at the very beginning of that math problem, where I was like, what is this problem about? Let me hear it again. Let me see if I can figure out what we're really trying to do here. So that's what they're doing. Then sometimes they plan, like they think about how they need to solve the problem. So in this particular question, they are actually trying to solve a problem about a chromosome separation error during meiosis, which is tricky for students to learn. And so they're talking about how they're going to have to solve the problem. They're planning to draw out meiosis. And this is cool because when students do this, they almost always get it right. But a lot of students don't plan and don't draw in this particular question. And when they don't do that, it's harder for them to solve the problem. So we're just really getting started with trying to understand this process of problem solving using this set of codes. And what we're doing now that we've kind of tested some questions with students in an interview setting is we're administering these questions to my whole genetics class. And we're doing that online. So they go on, they read the question, and then they have to type in how they're solving the problem before they give the answer. So there's obviously some problems with that in that they might not type in a very good explanation of how they're solving the problem, but we tell them that we're giving them credit for their explanation and credit for their answer. So we're hoping that that will allow, we tried this already and it worked relatively well. Not everybody gave a good explanation, so we had to throw out some answers and couldn't analyze them, but most people gave some kind of an explanation of their process. So then we're looking at those actual written explanations of their problem solving and looking at whether there are patterns between students who solve the question correctly and students who don't solve the question correctly. So over time, we think we'll assemble sort of a pattern that students follow that may represent maybe the best way that those students have found to solve the problem. And we'll compare that to how experts solve the same problems to see whether there are differences or similarities. So there's a lot of work to be done still here, but I think that it's going to be really interesting to see how students, and these are just individual scenarios, how are students solving problems, and if they get stuck, what kinds of things help them? So what we plan to do after we kind of understand what their problem-solving process is to give them some kind of clues or prompts. So content prompts, like a fact, like did you remember that in order to calculate probability you have to do this, or you need to multiply these two numbers together? Just factual information that might help them solve the problem. Versus giving them some ideas about how they might solve the problem. So we don't want to guide them through it and just have them memorize the steps of solving a problem, because that's boring and rote, right? That's not creative, that's not real problem solving, that's just memorizing something. But we think that we might be able to clue them in to some of the steps that are useful for solving a pedigree problem. Like, did you look at this particular feature of the problem? Have you thought about how you might be able to distinguish one genotype from another based on ancestry or something like that? So we're hoping to test those kinds of interventions to see whether they can help students solve problems. Yeah, Renee?
It would be interesting to code individuals versus small groups.
Yes. Yes, very, very definitely something I'm interested in. So at the moment, I'm going to collect just individual problem solving. But what I would like to do in the future is to then compare how an individual solves a problem on their own, and then see how that maybe same individual would solve it in a group. It's obviously a different problem. So does the behavior of an individual change when they can collaborate with somebody for problem solving? Because you could imagine a scenario where you capture their sort of initial problem solving, not necessarily abilities, but the way they solve their problem. Then you look at how they solve it with a partner, and then you see if when they solve another one individually, if their behaviors have changed based on their interaction with peer. What's that?
Alone they give up.
Alone they might give up and Google it. I mean, we hope we're asking them questions that they can't Google. Like they have to go through some sort, but they try. You're right, they try, Right, and so this is the thing that's always, frustrating about students is that while you have them as a captive audience in the classroom, you can hopefully control what they're doing and give them instruction and help, but when you send them off on their own, then you kind of lose control over what they might do. So if we can maybe train them in the classroom, so that's why I would like to see them solving the problems together in the classroom as well, because I think that might be different than, like you're saying, Googling the answer. Yeah. I think, did you have your hand?
Yeah, sure. It seems like a lot of your work is looking at how to teach students critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
Have you thought about, or have you looked at how the skills that you teach in your class might bleed into other classes that are maybe completely unrelated?
Yeah, that's a great question. What he asked was that might the skills that I'm trying to teach my students in my class, or that the intro bio instructors are trying to teach their students, might bleed over into later classes that they take. So far we haven't really done any longitudinal studies. I think that those kinds of studies are really necessary. The problem is they take a long time because they're longitudinal studies. And so the ideal would be to follow a student from the beginning of their time at CU Boulder to the end of their time and to watch their growth and take lots of different kinds of measurements of that student and what kinds of things can they do when they come in, what kinds of things can they do when they go out. So what did they learn in this class that was applicable to the next class? We're not really set up to measure that. I mean, I would love to get like a huge multi-million-dollar grant to measure something like that, because it really would take a lot of people to collect that data. So I think it's an excellent question and it needs to be done, but I haven't done it yet. Maybe in the future. I think there was a hand over here. Somebody? No? Anybody else have any questions? Yes.
Are we into the question?
Yes, we're in the question. I don't have a conclusion slide because I'm not cutting off the very end of my talk, so there's no conclusion slide. We're in the questions.
I'm just curious about, and maybe the case that the best approach is you have a lecture class with 400 people in it, so they're all there at the same time, and then you're trying to break them up into little groups. What about the alternative of no lectures at all? The lecture, the content is online, and really what you focus on are small group discussion sections to get together. Is clicker questions kind of an adaptation to big lectures?
Yeah.
That we could actually
do away with? So good question. So the question is about whether, in a lecture format, whether we're sort of maybe trivializing things by asking simple clicker questions. Would it be better just to have all the work in the classroom be in small groups and no lecturing? I think that's what your question is.
Sort of, yeah. And related is this idea that, a lot of times, lectures are good performers.
Yeah.
The charismatic sort of people talking about stuff. And is it the best use of their time?
Right.
For them to be standing around, for these chunks of time.
Sure.
Students are working on their problems.
Sure. Great philosophical questions, which many people are trying to collect evidence on. So I'll tell you my own personal philosophy is I lecture very little in the classroom. I don't have what I would call a flipped classroom, and there are like 1,000 definitions of flipped classroom anyway, so, but I guess a real 100% flipped classroom would be no lecturing at all in the classroom. The students get all their content outside of class, and they work in groups independently, with the professor maybe walking around and talking to them. I do what I would call maybe something like hybrid, like they definitely come to class prepared, they do some stuff before they get there, they watch videos before they come, but I kind of guide them through the class period. So I do a little bit of lecturing, I ask some questions, and then I let them work on problems in small groups. There is maybe half of the time that they spend in class every day is working in small groups on problems. That's my personal philosophy. I like the way that works. I think it's effective. But we need to still study, what is the most effective use of class time. Sometimes a really excellent lecturer and a really awesome performer can teach students something. Well-timed, well-executed on a certain kind of content. I would never stand up here and say lecturing should never be done. That's not my philosophy at all. But I think the philosophy should be, you should do what works. You should do what helps the students learn the best. And so you should be engaged in the process of measuring that. So maybe you're not the kind of person who wants to lecture at all. Great, then don't. See if you can get your students to learn in a different way and measure their learning and present it to your colleagues and say, look, I was able to achieve awesome performance and awesome learning in my students without giving a single lecture. So we need to collect more data like that, because I think there's more than one way to facilitate student learning, and I don't want to say that one way is better than any other way. Yeah, yeah, in the back, and then I'll cut to you. It's for participation, yeah.
So what kinds of assessments do you use for the students in the class? So
How they're graded?
how are they getting?
Yeah, so for both of our intro, so genetics at our university is a second semester freshman class, so it really is part of our intro series. So for intro and genetics, we have weekly problem sets the students solve. So these are short answer types of questions, often involving calculations or analysis or application at least. And sometimes there are multiple choice questions as well, so they have that every week. For my students, they take a multiple choice pre-class kind of quiz before coming. That's graded before they come to class. That's on basic content that I hope they will have learned by watching the video that I made for them. And then they take some number of exams. In my class, I take 4 exams and a final. So there's actually a lot of points. And the participation component of class is really to get them to class, because I think that's where the learning is happening for most of the students, and I'm trying to facilitate that learning in the classroom. But again, that's just my philosophy. Like, that's how I'm assessing my students, is through a combination of pre-class assignments, which are supposed to be easy, problem sets, which are harder, and then exams, which basically look like all the things they've practiced. So they've practiced the skills already in class, and now they get a new set of questions that hopefully compared to like before I started teaching this class? No, unfortunately it's really hard to do that particular experiment where you treat half your students differently, because most of the human research councils that evaluate your proposal will not let you do that, because they think that you're treating the students differently and therefore they're getting a different educational experience in the same semester. You can get away with it if it's from year to year, like, oh, I used to do it that way and now I've changed, I'm doing it this way. So what I can tell you is that since I took over teaching this particular class, the failure rate has gone down, which I think is a good sign. I don't think I'm grading any easier than the person who taught the class before me. And we've also been administering a concept assessment to the students pre and post. So this is a set of questions that are not necessarily directly tied to the content I'm teaching. Of course, they are about the same content, but it's given as a way of marking their growth. And they make huge improvements by this measure. They made improvements before too, but they're actually higher now than they used to be. So I haven't done an official, like, publishable experiment on how my students have been impacted by the way I teach genetics, but I would say they're certainly doing as well as they used to do, and I think they're learning some additional skills that I'm not even measuring, like problem solving. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean,
I forgot Renee.
One thing that could be done, I suppose, in relation to that last question is look at what they do in the follow-up courses. Right? So
Absolutely, the longitudinal study.
Yeah, and compare. So my question, though, is actually related to this problem-solving,
Yeah.
coding, and framework. So something which doesn't appear, which is surprising to me, actually, is iteration.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was sort of wondering how you treat that.
Right.
I'm certain that it happens.
Yes, yes.
And so how you treat that.
Yes.
And then my second sort of question is, would it be fair to say that from your perspective, that when you're an instructor designing problems, authentic problems, that part of what you have in mind is they need to be such that students actually are forced to engage in all these behaviors. And if they don't engage in all these behaviors, it may be not authentic?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as to the first question about iteration, we're coding every sentence the student writes, and so there is an iteration, like there isn't a code for iteration, but if they recall and analyze and then recall again, or draw and analyze and then draw again, we would just see that in our code of their process.
It's not quite the same kind of, that's not what I really meant by iteration.
Okay, what do you mean?
It was more like what you sort of suggested with your son.
Yeah.
You make a hypothesis that you then disprove.
Yes.
And make another one.
Okay, I hear you. So I don't know if the questions we're asking them are going to generate that kind of hypothesis. With the math problem, it was like, well, I got to test some numbers to see if it works. But with a pedigree problem, what we do see is sometimes people will eliminate an answer. They'll be like, oh, it's not X-linked recessive. And so we have a code for eliminating something and then saying, so now I've got left these 3 possibilities, so now I'm going to check and see if those are right. So we didn't call that making a hypothesis, we called it eliminating. So maybe that's as iterative as it gets. And maybe it's just the kind of problem, right? So if we had a problem where there was more of an opportunity for them to form a hypothesis, disprove it, and form another one, we would see that behavior. As to your second question, yeah, I mean, the kinds of questions that we give the students and expect them to solve obviously is going to impact the kinds of behaviors we see. So I don't know exactly how to answer your question because I'm asking them questions that are like the kinds of questions they might solve in class so that they're relevant to the students and it allows them to practice this idea of being able to think about how to solve a problem. But they're not totally novel, and if they can't solve the problem, they're not going to be totally penalized either because it's just a practice kind of problem. So there may be ways to make this more meaningful to them, and I'm not sure exactly. I'll have to just keep thinking about that. Yeah. Renee, I forgot Renee earlier.
I just wanted to talk about what Jack asked, and it's going to sound like I'm looking for job security, but it's not. I think something really cool happens when a teacher is in the room when they're solving problems, because after they work on it, they ask better questions, and they ask the questions to the whole class,
Yeah.
and that changes what the teacher may say next and do next. It's not a canned lecture. I may go off completely what I was going to talk about and talk about what all these questions keep addressing. Because do you want to keep going if they're still confused about something back there? And
Right.
that the FaceTime really makes that possible. Do you get behind schedule? Yes, I do. But you're helping them in real time. And sometimes, in fact, I would say often, the questions they ask help me more than it helps them. I'm like, oh, I can go back and fix what I tried to say before. Oh, that'd be a great exam question.
Yeah. So much of what we do with the students in the classroom when we're in an environment where we're listening to what they think and what they can and cannot do is what we call formative. So your assessments of them are now formative for both you and them. Yeah. Like they know, oh, I didn't get that at all. I have no idea what she was trying to ask me with this question. And you have to talk about it with them. And then it informs you that you screwed up somehow because you didn't communicate to them well enough, or you didn't ask the right kind of question, or they simply haven't learned it yet, right? So this back and forth between the instructor and the students is what I think really makes for a rich classroom. Whether you like to lecture or whether you want everyone to be active all the time, you're setting up a system where you're talking to the students and they have a chance to talk with you, right? I mean, we all hope for that anyway, but sometimes in a classroom, only the bravest students will ask a question, and then you're not really getting the pulse of the group.
And that makes it more fun to teach by far.
Yeah.
But I think they have more fun too, because you heard them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You heard that they were confused, and you're like, oh, yeah.
They feel validated, which is an important part of.
And then they start asking more questions.
Yeah. So I want to be respectful of time. It is 5 after 5, but I'm happy to take additional questions if some people need to leave. I don't want to keep you guys here. Thank you very much.